There's two reasons for today that we thought would be interesting for all of you. Number one, we want to talk about what we admittedly think is the most important question in the atmosphere in terms of the climate and chemistry on the planet today. That by itself is reasonably interesting and is important to know. But the second part we want to talk about is, and we'll be trying to familiarize you with, is what's the consequences for human health, sustainability, biodiversity, coastal zones, and economics for the state of California, and in fact later for the planet. So we want to show both of those parts because that makes it a fairly wide-ranging effort, and it's something that we're involved with here at UCSD besides just the chemistry and climate parts of what you'll hear about. So what I want to do is give a bit of an overview of the subject that we're going to talk about today, and then turn it over to each of my colleagues here, which will give you a different perspective on the problem. What we're going to specifically talk about is atmospheric aerosols. And aerosols in the planet or in the atmosphere are basically solid particles suspended in the atmosphere. This includes things like sea spray, soot particles, and what have you. And there would affect the visibility in our region. In the last few days, those of you who have probably driven up and down the coast to go home notice that we've had these fairly spectacular red sunsets with a brown particulate layer hanging out over the ocean. That's largely from the aerosols that are sitting out there over the ocean. The importance of these, from our perspective, of course, is what it means for the climate and chemistry of the planet, but it also affects the health and the visibility and the biology of a region. And that's what I wanted to briefly talk about today before my colleagues go into more of the details. One of the details that Professor Ramanathan will talk about that makes this a very interesting problem to all of us at work is this issue of long-range transport. You'll hear about a very large and important experiment that Professor Ramanathan ran called the Indian Ocean experiment. And one of the outcomes was the fact that it was observed that we have long-range trajectories of these particles possible, coming from as far away as the Far East into California in less than a week time scale. On the other side of the United States, the same is true, is that we're emitting particles also that are crossing the Atlantic Ocean. So this is a problem that quickly becomes global, and you'll hear more of that from my colleagues. The why do you care part of the talk here. This is from the State of California Environmental Report Card in 2001. And what it found is that from breathing these particles, if you live in the South Coast Basin, as many as 8,800 people per year die from breathing these particles. This is mostly from cardiovascular disease. And this is reasonably well known, and it's been quantified. So it's not just an issue of the climate and the chemistry, but rather it's an issue of what it means for human health. To go into that a little bit more, one of the special particles, and I'm not going into the chemistry even though I'm a chemist, there's a particle called nitrate, such as you use in your fertilizer, that's made because of pollution, mostly fossil fuel burning. It's transported long distance, and what you see on this map of the United States is pre and post 1972, and what the little dots basically represent are outbreaks of red tide, toxic blooms, and fish kills. Fish kills then later propagate further down the food chain, and what you find is marine mammal kills and mortalities throughout the United States. And you can see what the growth has been. This is from the transport of aerosols into the coastal region. So even though it's a microscopic particle and transported long distances, the consequences of this can be fairly severe and real. Other effects include the biodiversity. And on the bottom left, you see a before and after picture of a very healthy green growing place on the western United States, and secondarily in the insert below, what happens after the deposition of nitrate, which changes the type of plants that grow locally in a region, only because of the deposition. On the right shows one of the algae blooms and fish kills associated with nitrate deposition in the United States. And this is not only the western United States up through Alaska, this also includes coastal Florida, both in the Gulf of Mexico and in the Atlantic Ocean. Going a little further, the effects of sulfate aerosols, which is associated with acid rain, is shown on the left. One sees the red spruces that are healthy pre-1963, and on the right you can see at the basic level what the effect has been on the health of the plants in the region. Again, this is because of the depositions in the area. One of the questions you frequently get, and it's a very valid question, is, well, how do you really know that there's health effects associated with aerosol inhalation? How do you know that it's not an artifact of something else in terms of the data that you're taking? How do you know that it's a causal relationship rather than a statistical artifact? And I'm not going to give a medical lecture, but some of the sorts of information that's out there, besides some fairly sophisticated experiments, this is an example of a steel mill plant, unnamed for this talk, that in September of 1985 to 1986, you can see the number of children that were admitted to hospital because of respiratory disease. In these sorts of issues, people that are stressed cardiovascularly, meaning children and elderly people, are very susceptible to events that are associated with, for example, ozone and aerosols in this case. And so you see the number of admissions in the given region, and then the steel mill was closed down for internal reasons. And you can see the immediate consequences in the center panel there of the number of admissions of children for cardiovascular and bronchitis sorts of events. Then the steel mill opens again, and you go back and you can see that it's business as usual in terms of the number of children that are admitted because of breathing disorder. So one could argue, well, that's not really causal, and that's true. You can make those sorts of arguments, but the evidence is fairly strong, and it is somewhat of a smoking gun. And there's a whole panorama of events such as this that one can cite to, besides the hardcore medical experiments that have been done and medical measurements that have been made. This is a recent paper within the past year or two, and what you see is a curve that shows the number of these aerosol particles on the bottom axis here with the expected death rate. The dots are the expected, the solid lines are the people that have died, and you can see the number of people you're talking about in the U.S. is on the order of 60,000 people per year and expected to grow. So it's a non-trivial problem, and this is a study that was published within the past couple of years or so, and there's a number of people working. Other effects in the state of California are shown on the left here. One can see a coastal sage region here on the left, and in the insert you can see what's happened after the deposition of nitrate aerosols. It's essentially gone to no biology at all from a relatively normal coastal sage scrub. This is an issue that's ongoing now, and a number of us involved with is in Lake Tahoe. You can see on the little plot on the right is the visibility versus time from 1967 to 1998, and you can see the degradation of the clarity of Lake Tahoe. Probably all of you have been to Lake Tahoe, and you know one of the real attractions of going to Lake Tahoe is the outstanding clarity of the water. So this is an issue that's affecting the health of the lake. It's an important issue, and it's controversial because of trying to decide where does the nitrate come from. And so trying to understand the sources and how these aerosols move around in the atmosphere has a lot of isolated or very specific examples, including the Lake Tahoe region and its water clarity. When one drives out, you saw the transparencies or the pictures previously where you saw where an entire biosystem moves out and another one, which is alien, moves into a region. What happens in association with that is that you will typically collapse an entire ecosystem associated with it. So as the local plants move out and the aliens that come in, the biology and the biota that are associated with that particular biologic area change. So that leads to extinctions in some specific instances. And here's an example in the San Francisco area of some butterflies that are endangered. The area from here up through Los Angeles, the so-called Zone 19, is one of the most endangered and complex biological areas in the United States, or in the planet for that matter, and it's very sensitive to changes in the biota. Finally, this is a point that I wanted to make here. This is a photograph of an electron microscope picture from the experiment that I mentioned previously called the Indian Ocean experiment. And these are soot particles. Several points to make from this, not that these are glamorous pictures as such, but there's several things to notice. First of all, it's the complexity of these particles. It's very difficult to measure these, and it's even more difficult to measure what's inside of them. And it's a crucial issue. First of all, with regard to the health. How do you get the onset of cardiovascular disease? How do you get the onset of other diseases that may be associated with the inhalation of aerosols? Isn't known at the sort of level that you need to know it to make medical responses. So one needs to answer questions about how are these particles made and exactly what are they. And until Professor Prater's advancement in his field of learning how to measure these particles one at a time, one couldn't begin to answer those questions. And now that we know something about the transport, we know more about what's happening in the environment, but less about what it means to us in a given region. So those are the sort of issues that are out there. It's the answers to the question is, well, why do we care besides the standard chemistry and climatology and climate change and radiation in a given region? That's the answer to that part of the question. The answer is human health, and it's a real issue. So I'm now going to introduce my colleague from Scripps, Professor Ramanathan, who will tell you more about how these measurements are made and a little bit about the modeling.
Mark talked about the particulates from a variety of interest in terms of the impact of the health, of the ecosystem, the agriculture, etc. But I come from a different perspective. My work is really on the global warming issue, the impact of the greenhouse gases. I became interested in the particular problem because it seems like they may have a large cooling effect on the planet. So that has varieties of implication to the past and the future. The past is simply that they might have offset quite a bit of the global warming, and since we are regulating these aerosols, maybe we will see an acceleration of this warming with the cooling effect. So the particulate issue, interesting enough that it starts out as a local problem, an urban haze. I'll show you some pictures of the haze from here. Then it becomes a global issue, and I'll show you how that becomes a global issue. And the fascinating thing is, from the global part, it comes and feeds back. Impacts are local. So that's the connection I want to make, which really ties into this California Earth Observatory. I was pleased to see these are experts my colleagues pulled from recent President Bush's State of the Union address, and the two things he's saying we will do, both are happening here. The first is apparently, I was not here, I was in Stockholm at minus 10 degrees weather on the day he had delivered the State of the Union address. First it says, I'll work together in the months I had on for a cleaner environment. And I think that's one of the things we are interested. The second, we are particularly pleased, he says America is working with Russia and China and India in ways we never have before to achieve peace and prosperity. In fact, this Indian Ocean experiment and the follow-on, we are really working with the whole Asian region, India, China, Japan, to really understand what's happening on the environment and how we are mutually impacting each other's backyard. So let me take you down, take you up, in fact, to Nepal. And I want to show you a picture of a flight we did. We was, one of the small aircraft. So on the north end, and the west end, you're looking up at Mount Everest. So I'll show you a picture looking up Mount Everest and then looking south towards India. Okay, it's taken from an altitude of about 10,000, 12,000 feet. So you can see when we are looking down southwards, we see that haze above the mountain range. It's about 12,000 to 14,000 feet. That is the significant impact. The height at which the haze reaches tells us tremendous amount. Is it a local or a global problem? And I'll touch on that. A day later, we flew about 2,500 miles down southwards into an island, Maldives. This is about 500 miles south and west of India, and this is where Scripps, we have an observatory there. And you see the same haze still hanging around from an aircraft about 10,000, 12,000 feet. Okay? Then this is a picture taken even another 1,000 miles further south towards the equatorial Indian Ocean, and you can see the haze still persisting. Are they all one and the same or coming from different sources? Of course, one of the primary sources is fossil fuel combustion, coming from automobiles, and particularly they have a more tougher problem with diesel and two-stroke engines. So this is a satellite picture which was, I want to start on the day we were doing a field experiment with multiple aircraft, about 6 aircraft, 2 ships, and several satellites all lined up in that part of the world. It's close to about $30 million experiment involving over 250 scientists from around the world, including my distinguished colleagues here. And you can see the haze, in the Himalayan region spreading all the way, okay? And in fact, a more close-up picture, you can see how it's almost like a river just flowing down into the ocean. And the problem, in fact, we discovered is further severe, but towards China, eastwards. So this is the experiment I mentioned, which Mark mentioned, which was done, it was led from Scripps Institution of Oceanography. My colleague, Professor Paul Crutzen, a Nobel laureate in chemistry, and we led this team. And the results have just, come out about a few months ago. So let me start with, we saw that haze. I want to show you how that haze becomes a global problem, okay? What you see here is a map of the world from the north and the south, and the center band is what we call intertropical convergence zone. This is where the air from the north and the south meet in the zone, then the air lifts up, gives rise to the huge tropical clouds, hurricanes, and all kinds of severe. So we're going to take you gradually towards the Indian Ocean, and you will see that this intertropical convergence zone moves north and south. That basically provides the barrier between the air from the north and the south. So during our experiment, in the wintertime, it's pushed south, so the air piles up. It just builds up as a haze, okay? And then during the summertime, it moves north, so it leaks to the southern hemisphere. And this sort of happens every year. That's the reason we were there. It's a spectacular experiment. Now you see a two-dimensional cross-section. So that on your far side, you see the air would flow in, gets into the intertropical convergence zone, okay? Then lifts up, and then once it gets to those altitudes, within a matter of a few days, it just zips around the world. And you saw the trajectory which Mark Thiemens showed. That was from 3 or 4 kilometers. Okay, and we saw that haze, and that can get transported all the way across the Pacific in a matter of somewhere between 4 to 7 days. And so our aircraft measurements, we were flying back and forth, north and south, and then we had also launched balloons, and then our satellite was mapping. So we used the in situ measurements to figure out what was going on, and then used that to interpret satellite measurements, map this whole haze, okay? And so this is again a trajectory which we showed. This is now from a model calculations, that if the haze went up to 3 kilometers, how far does it travel? And you can see the plume from China. So I've given you how the local problem, that is we driving our cars, putting out this particulates, gets moved up and then shipped around, the so-called Pacific storm tracks and variety of motions in the atmosphere. By the way, before we start pointing fingers just at the Asian region, the same thing happens. Our pollution, for example, I show from the northeast, goes all the way across the European region. Okay? And the Europeans then send their pollution on downwards, far east. So we are all connected together in a remarkably quick period within a matter of 6 to 7 days. Okay? So do we see this? And now I'm going to show you actual data collected from a satellite of this global distribution of these aerosols. So this is data collected by spectrometers. They're some of the best instruments launched to figure out this particulate. So what we are seeing here is the column integrated, the total amount of particulates in the atmosphere, but we are seeing a global picture. By the time you see the thing to be white, you can't see the sun when you look up. So it's such a dense plume. And you can see the Asian haze we call the Asian brown cloud, India and China. What is very interesting is that we see the dust cloud all the way transported across the Pacific. This is not on one day, it's on a monthly average. That's what makes it. So that's when it becomes a climate problem. If it is just one day, then it's a local pollution issue. And then you can see the same thing, biomass burning from Africa, again the Amazon region, the biomass burning. And then from our own sulfate pollution, you can see from the East Coast, the yellow region, they're all particulates in the atmosphere, submicron particulates. Just want to conclude in the next few minutes to see why we are interested in this. In addition to the local issue, the first thing is some of the new data are just showing some fascinating results. They directly suppress rainfall, reduce the efficiency of precipitation. That's plumes coming off of Australia. I think this was done by an Australian scientist, so Australia is north, and the rest of the world is southwards. So you can see the yellow region, that's spreading around 1,000 miles. The bright regions are where the plumes are coming, and the bright means there's no rain. The surrounding clouds are raining. So the first thing we are thinking is that this particulates may be suppressing rain and pushing the rain away from populated regions, okay? And let me just touch on one more thing. The more insidious effect of this particulates, this is what we had discovered in the Indian Ocean, and now we are seeing this in many parts of the world, including the Mediterranean and other regions. They cut the sunlight down by a large amount. We already know that. You know, this, when the haze looks brownish, it means it's reducing sunlight. That reduction, of course, would cause a cooling. That was why we were after. But also, it has an impact on the water budget of the planet, simply because the water for the rain comes from evaporation from the ocean. And the energy for that evaporation is sunlight. So you cut the evaporation down, the way the system would respond is cutting down the evaporation. So since what goes up has to come down, you cut the evaporation, you cut down the rainfall. There we are on reasonable solid grounds. What we don't know is who are the winners and the losers. For example, in this particular, when we took the Indian Ocean haze and put it in the region, interesting enough, it rained more in India in this model, but it suppressed rain everywhere else. Okay, so it's not a local effect. You do something one part, some other part would respond to that, and we already know that. For example, the El Nino, but 3,000 miles downstream, the Central Pacific warms, and we feel it here in terms of our altered rainfall. So these are the insidious ways how the local effect feeds on the global, and then the global feeds back as a local rainfall. These are the issues we don't know. And the thing I would just want to conclude with some of the preliminary work we are starting as far as with respect to this California Earth Observatory is we have put an instrument, a laser instrument, here in this campus to see if we see air from China coming our way. And so this was a picture taken yesterday, and you'll see that haze, it's a brownish haze. Invariably, we have seen this haze once it exceeds about half a kilometer. It's coming either north from Los Angeles area or south from Mexico, okay, depending on the wind pattern. And you can see our laser instrument catching that haze. The brown region on the bottom is the haze we are seeing, and then once we pick up layers from different altitudes, if we see the haze coming up to, for example, 4 kilometers, then we know it's coming at least 3,000 to 4,000 miles away. And we have satellite pictures to track down where it's coming from. So that's the first thing we are trying to do, develop a climatology of where the air over San Diego is coming from. Okay? Near the surface, it's coming from the surrounding regions. But once you go above in the atmosphere, if you go up to half a kilometer, the air is coming from or surrounding 100 kilometers. You go to 1 kilometer, it's coming from the surrounding 200 onwards. By the time you go to 4 kilometers, the air could be coming all the way from China or all the way from South America. With that, I introduce the next speaker, Professor Kim Prather, who is doing some pioneering work on really figuring out what's inside these particulates. And from there, we can deduce where they're coming from.
First of all, welcome to UC San Diego. I'm a relative newcomer here. I've been at UC Riverside for 9 years and then got lured down to the appeal of San Diego. A new area to study the air, although there aren't as many particles here as there were in Riverside, I have to say. Briefly, I'd like to give you an overview. This is going to be switching gears, sort of. All of a sudden, we're going from sort of, I don't have as many pretty pictures, but I'm going to focus more on the analytical chemistry, give you a feel for, how do we even know these things that Mark and Ram have talked about. And then sort of, we've developed a new technique over the last about 9-10 years that I'm going to talk about, which we refer to as aerosol time of flight mass spectrometry, or ATOF-MS. I'll abbreviate it quite a bit. And then I'll wrap up with just some other applications which you may be interested in. And they aren't atmospheric. I mean, they are atmospheric, but they're just a different set of applications, especially in light of recent events are coming to the forefront. So just to give you a feel for the traditional methods that have been used in the past, we really have been limited in our ability to sort of understand aerosols and their role in chemistry. Most of the techniques that were developed in atmospheric chemistry research focused on the gas phase. So if you hear about high pollution levels, you're normally talking about ozone. And there's also NOx and sulfur SOx, different sulfur species, nitrogen species. Gas phase species on a relative scale are much easier to measure. They're just a molecule, and they're all molecules of ozone look just the same. However, with particles, that's not the case. And so we really, as I say, until about the last decade, we really had sort of a limited knowledge set of what aerosols were. And basically, just to calibrate you, a lot of this was because of the methodology that existed for measuring them. Typically what's done, and still done actually, is you just pull air through a piece of filter paper for hours to days to collect enough material to be able to analyze things and say what's there. One particle doesn't have that much material, so you need literally billions of these particles collected on a piece of filter paper to say what's present. This is actually a really costly approach, even though it's cheap to buy a filter paper in a filter. It ends up to be really costly to do the type of analytical chemistry that's required. And so basically what ends up happening is that we will only collect limited snapshots of what's in the air. We'll just we'll say, okay, right now is when we think the bad stuff's out there, so we'll look for this 8-hour period, and we'll do it once today, and we'll do it again in 3 days, and you basically really have a limited sort of time window of what's going on. Because you need enough material, it requires, as I mentioned, long sampling times. So we didn't really understand how particles change on real short time scales. And by short time scales, I mean like minutes. There's a lot of errors that occur when you pull something onto a piece of filter paper and it has to sit there for hours to days between, while you're collecting it, and then before you analyze it, you have a lot of transformations and things will change. And so you really have to question when you get the answer at the end, a few months later, was that really representative of what was in the atmosphere? This ties in a lot with determining the sources of particles. This is a big issue. If we can figure out where the particles of concern are coming from, then we can start to regulate in a more specific fashion instead of blanket regulations, which I'll talk about a little bit more towards the end. If we can actually look at each individual particle, we can start to, as I say, determine the different sources. And a biggie is that, especially in light of things that are going on with these days with concern over chemical and biological warfare, is that we don't really know what's present in the air right away. There is no method for particles. There is for gas phase, but there's no method for particles that you can just turn on an instrument and see what's there right now. So that's what we're trying to do. And our approach is, as mentioned, we look at each individual particle. So, out of the tailpipe of a truck, there's literally billions of particles, but we pick out each particle that comes out in the atmosphere. And this is a simple cartoon that sort of shows why the differences in information you can obtain. The picture on the left, just envision this is your piece of filter paper where you've collected a bunch of different chemicals, which I've labeled simply by A, B, C, D, and E. They're all different. Basically, with a piece of filter paper, you have to assume that every particle looks identical. And so that means you're scrambling the chemical signatures from the different sources. On the right is the type of information we get, where you begin to see very specific associations between the different chemical species. Those are the fingerprints that allow us to distinguish between the particles and the sources they came from. And so what this allows us to do is we can actually say, okay, that was a gasoline part. We analyze millions of these particles in any given time, and we can actually say, okay, that was a diesel particle, that was a gasoline particle, that was a biomass burning particle. And we add them up and we can figure out the relative fractions and where they came from. It's really critical to be able to get these single particle signatures for source characterization. I mean, to say figuring out where they came from. Then we can target the people, where the pollution, the big pollution sources are, and specifically go after and reduce those sources. as Ron mentioned a little bit, we really don't understand how the chemistry of the particles is affecting global climate change. Some types of aerosol particles, depending on their chemical makeup, cool the atmosphere. Some actually can warm the atmosphere. So they have different effects. You can't say aerosols are all warming or all cooling like you can with the gas. And so we're trying to do measurements at the same time as a lot of the radiation measurements are being made to understand the chemical content and how that's playing a role in global climate change. And then a big question is, what are the particles that are causing these deleterious health effects? No one really knows. There's 100 different theories out there of why people are dying. The number is going up. We used to only attribute things to respiratory effects. If there were respiratory effects, we said it was particles. Now we're starting to see that there's actually, as Mark mentioned, cardiovascular effects. When people die, they actually will look in the heart and they actually are finding deposits of particles. So they're getting into our bloodstream, and this has shaken people's views, and it's actually taking the numbers that we had, the 8,000 and 60,000, and it's going to bump them up significantly now that we understand there's more things going on than we thought. So why continuous sampling? This is just a simple picture showing pollutant level, some pollutant level, any type of particle or gas versus time. And typically, as I say, usually you're looking at about a 12-hour average, and people used to think that was enough. So you can see the blue line sort of tells you how much is out there on any given day. You can cut that down to a 4-hour average at best, and you start to see the green lines. So you get a little more information on how things are staggered. But what happens if, like where the arrow is, you all of a sudden see a high number of hospital admits, and these are tracked. There's a lot of people going in for respiratory or cardiovascular problems. We want to know what's in that spike. And so by looking at real time, we can actually focus on the particles right in that window and figure out the sources of where they came from and control those particles. That's our ideal picture. The size range of particles that we're interested in looking at, the top just shows the optical detection window. We scatter light, as I'll show you, to detect these particles. So the range we sort of focus on from a measurement viewpoint is about 0.1 micrometers to about a little less than 100 microns. This is just a list of different types of particles that are common in the atmosphere and their size ranges that they cover. And what you see by size alone, which we can measure really well, there's a lot of instruments that give you size distributions of particles. There's a wide range and there's a lot of overlap. So size alone is not going to allow you to discriminate between the sources. Added to the bottom is now people are starting to think more about, can we pick out individual bacteria? Can we pick out individual viruses? And you can see the size range for those. So in our research, we're trying to discriminate between all these different types of particles by their chemical signatures. We also get the size. This is a picture of the instrument that we developed. This is actually a commercial version of the instrument. Basically, it looks very much like our regular, everything's the same except that companies like to put metal panels on things. I don't know why, but it really is the same. But it's about 6 feet long, about 5 feet tall. It's on wheels, it's transportable, it's gone all over the world. But basically, it was a major advance in that it allowed you to now look at the size and chemical composition of particles in the atmosphere on a continuous basis. It's won a number of awards for representing a pretty significant advance. So briefly, I want to show you how this technique works. I'm going to describe how this technique works, and then I'll show you a cartoon of how it works, which will make things a little bit more clear, I hope. Basically, particles are suspended. There's millions, billions, or whatever in this room. You just can't see them. They're too small. Our instrument is under vacuum, so it just pulls the particles in a continuous basis. They come into the instrument right here. They come through a region where there's a laser beam that the particle passes through. At that point, the particle scatters light. We detect that particle. It then goes a little bit further, passes through another laser, and it scatters light again. We measure the time between those two scattering events. That gives us the velocity of that particle, how fast that particle is moving through the system. We can use that piece of information for two things. Smaller particles move faster, bigger particles move slower. And so we can use the speed to determine the size of the particle. Actually, it's what's called the aerodynamic size, which means it tells us exactly where it's going to settle out in our body. So it's a really important health effect parameter. The other thing we can do, though, since we knew how long it takes to get between point A and point B, is that we can actually figure out exactly when that particle is going to get to the center of our chemical analyzer, which is this long tube right here, and we fire a pulse laser and desorb an ionized species from that, all the chemical species from that particle, and we analyze it in this what's called a time of flight mass spectrometer. So that's kind of like, you're going to see a bunch of lights flashing and things happening, and I want you to understand sort of, I'll explain it as we go. Okay, so here's the system. Basically, the lasers are on. They're actually oriented perpendicular to one another, so we only look at the particles that are going right through the center of the system. Here comes a particle, scatters light, fire, chemical analysis. There's the chemical composition of one particle, and this is the size of those particles growing in the size distribution. So it just does one particle after another on a continuous basis. So then we can do some sort of analysis to look at the different fingerprints and discriminate between the different types of particles. That's a real simple picture. We can break things down into different types of soil and different types of sea salt, whether they're reacted and transformed or not. The organic is just combustion particles, so we can actually hopefully break that down further into gas versus diesel versus biomass, all the different combustion sources. So initially our motivation, as I say, starting out in Riverside was, this is actually taken off the chemistry loading dock at UC Riverside. And what you see on the left is actually a really nice view of a mountain. And unfortunately, there weren't as many days on the left as there were on the right. And what's happening on the right is, it's just basically those are particles. Particles are very efficient at light scattering, especially in the range of solar radiation. And so they basically completely block the mountain. And as I say, there's a lot more days that look like the right side than the left side. And that's actually getting a lot better. That was our initial motivation. The health effects has become a huge motivation for our research. I mentioned EPA regulations. Being a chemist, it was sort of alarming, the regulations as they stand. Just to calibrate you, what's regulated in particles is, they say they're a mix of chemicals. And so how do you really regulate something in a particle? Well, basically, the regulations are what are called PM 2.5 and PM 10. For those of you who aren't familiar with the terminology, that's particulate matter 2.5 microns and particulate matter 10 microns. And what that says is that basically the mass of all particles of those sizes, there's a specific mass that's allowed. And the alarming thing by these regulations is that means that if you have a day where you have high winds and we have a lot of sea salt in the area, or you're in a dust-laden region where you have a lot of dust, or you're in a region where you just have lots of industrial pollution, you have a certain mass you're allowed to have, and regardless of what the chemical components are in that mass, they're treated exactly the same. And I don't know about you, but I personally, would rather be breathing sea salt than, walking, than breathing the tailpipe of a bus or something. So there's big differences in the chemical composition of those two, and so we really wanted to start to get things to be more chemically based. And so we're working with EPA now to try and do this. As I mentioned, we focus on the pollution characterization, the visibility impairment. You're asking about when they became important. A big step for when aerosols became important was the ozone hole. With the discovery of the ozone hole, they couldn't explain why the ozone hole was there with just gas phase species, and they had to throw the ice particles in order to account for it. And so that became when they became highlighted as, wow, particles are actually making things happen that wouldn't happen if they weren't there. Global climate change has been mentioned a number of times. As I mentioned, we also are doing source characterization to distinguish between different sources. To give you a feel for that, this just shows single particle spectra. So when the particle's blown apart, we get each one of these. So that's one particle, another particle, and another particle, where these all, if you notice, have very different fingerprints. And that's what we want to be able to see. If they all look the same, if you collected this on a filter, they'd all be scrambled. And so for example, one thing that people like to use to say that there's a lot of biomass burning is a lot of potassium. That's the K+. And you can see all of these have a big potassium signal. So any of these could, on a piece of filter paper, they're all mixed together, you wouldn't really be sure what you have. But if you can actually pick out the different, very distinct fingerprints, you can start to figure out the fractions that are present in the atmosphere. Just shifting gears a little bit to wrap up, there are a lot of applications that we're involved in. There's industrial applications. Particles cause chip failure for small devices. Biological and chemical warfare detection is a biggie, especially now it's really being brought to the forefront. We want to be able to detect individual biological particles and give early warning. Sick building characterization, explosives, how do you detect explosives rapidly, and hazardous fume analysis. Those are just a few examples of areas that we've been contacted or working in. So in summary, I've described the technique that we've developed in our lab. It lets us get a unique view of individual particles instead of sort of scrambling all the information together. We now have a way that we can turn on the instrument and see what's present in the atmosphere right now, and we can begin to link and understand the health effects of particles. So I mentioned we can detect particles really fast, and so we can say what's present in the air right now. And then we're linking our studies in with global climate change and trying to understand the role of aerosols in global climate change. And with that, I will end.
Well, just a few words in conclusion. I think from the science part of it, you can sort of sense what our excitement is here in working on these problems. As Ram said, there's a 7 to 7 day connectivity for the planet. It's a global issue. It's not regional. It's not citywide. It's the whole planet. What the issue is with respect to aerosols, what does it mean for climate? What does it mean for the hydrologic cycle? What does it mean for global warming and global cooling? What does it mean for visibility? Are all state-of-the-art forefront issues that we're actively engaged in trying to answer these questions. At the physiological level, what does it mean for human health? How do respiratory diseases start? Cardiovascular disease start? How extensive is it? It's not known. One needs to have a connection between the people doing the atmospheric measurements and our colleagues on the other side of Gilman Drive in the School of Medicine. This is one of the main focuses we're trying to promote here at UCSD, that given the unusual collection of talent that we have, not only in the atmospheric community, but also in the modeling community, the supercomputer center being able to model this sort of data in real time, School of Medicine where people are interested in these sorts of issues with regard to human health. And what does it mean for the economy of the region? What does it mean for the economy of the state and the United States as a whole is unclear. We know from these sort of diseases there's tens of millions of man-hours lost per year just because of people staying home when they don't feel well from breathing this. This isn't counting the people that are dying from cardiovascular disease, but just people that aren't showing up in the workforce. What is that going to mean for us in a state? What does it mean in a time when the economy is impaired? We don't know. So we're trying to put together a very collective research effort that connects across the different disciplines to begin to answer questions like this. And the final part that we're very interested in doing, Ram showed you Window X and the massive effort that was involved in this experiment. This is probably, if not the largest environmental measurement program that was undertaken. But it was still an issue where we went out for 3 weeks, measured like mad collectively, and came back and analyzed everything. To really answer the questions that you've been hearing from all of us this morning, you need a permanent observation basis. You need to be able to see in real time, long term, what's going on to answer these questions. Otherwise, one never knows for certain how much of it is temporarily anomalous and how much of it is real and how much of it is the real science and how much of it is a one-time measurement. So we really want to focus in our future in terms of having a permanent observational basis to tie not only the measurements and the modeling efforts together, but to bring in the other aspects that are important for the sustainability of the planet, namely the economy and the human health and the biodiversity. So with that, I'm going to stop, sit down, and let people ask questions or have a discussion as we will. And thanks for coming.
Dan Hammer with Congresswoman Susan Davis. What kind of resources do you need to establish the permanent observational basis, and what is your plan to get these resources?
Well, we're in the beginning phase of that. The three of us and also Paul Crutzen here at San Diego at Scripps Institution of Oceanography are running the prototype, meaning we're setting up, and you'll see Kim's instrument this afternoon if you have time, to see exactly what do you need to measure, how do you measure it, and how do you handle the data, and what's the spectrum of measurements that you need to make to be able to say the sort of things you'd like to say about what's happening in a system. So we're actually right in the middle of doing that right now to be able to answer that question, because we want to do it at one place, define very well what the parameters are that we're going to need to know, and then start thinking at the same time as where else do you need to be on the planet, because ultimately it's all of our goal is to be able to understand the planet. But we'll start in La Jolla and being able to really see what's going to be needed to do this correctly.
We also want to be able to, fly north-south to look at along the coast. And so, although the observatory would be here, but it will have a long arm going back and forth through aircraft, through ships, and Scripps has its own research vessels. So I think, while San Diego locally would benefit tremendously from this, we're also thinking about the entire state and see how things are communicating with each other. I'm thinking the air, but I'm sure the coastal waters, there could be other issues.
When particles reach that 4-kilometer level that you talked about in your presentation, what happens to them after that first week? Do they stay at that level for a long, long time, or do they?
Well, the winds are blowing, so the wind will just blow it downstream. If they were to stay locally, I think those people would suffocate. But thank God for the winds. Same thing happens here. Up our mountains, if you climb, you'll see always a haze about a kilometer above you, because there is something with the circulation pushes up the air up the mountain, and so they just get stuck there.
So they settle eventually.
Yeah, good question. What's happening to all these particulates is they're generally falling down by gravity. As Mark said, the big ones fall quicker than the small ones. Ultimately, all these particles are destroyed, removed from the atmosphere either by gravitational settling, but the small particles would take a week longer to settle to the surface, or if they encounter rain, they will be removed, washed out. And so either we call it wet removal or dry deposition, one of the two ways they're removed. That's what gives them the 1 week to 2 weeks lifetime.
And did your work with Indox and similar work that's going on, I understand that it was only a 3-week period, but does it allow you to draw any conclusions about what part of the planet is getting hit the worst by these particles in general, or don't we know yet?
No, I think, for example, in the haze, spatial extent of the haze itself, I think the worst hit regions are the Asian region. Meaning, I think, of course, it's coming from their source. And then the next is, of course, the South America, the biomass burning. But our emissions are also large, almost compared with the Asian emission, except fortunately, because of meteorology, our pollution gets blown downstream into the Atlantic Ocean. So, but certain regions have peculiar meteorology, like Los Angeles smog. In part, it's there because of the inversion. If the wind were to blow like it's blowing in the East Coast, hopefully we won't have this smog problem as much. So the peculiar combination of meteorology and the so-called megacities is what gives rise to this pollution, to this buildup. But if it's not building up locally, it gets blown up elsewhere.
There's one other aspect that, and Kim started to mention it, but I should mention, that gives us another reason for wanting to do this and understanding how are particles created and how are they moved, where do they come from, and that has to do with the bioterrorism part. One reads a lot in the newspaper about what if our response is going to be, and that San Diego can be a test bed for doing this, and we have the infrastructure in terms of computation and high-speed data analysis to arm ourselves against it, or to think of a strategy in terms of a region. But the real issue, when you sit down and force it all the way back to the very beginning, is what are you going to measure, and how are you going to measure it, and where are you going to measure it, before you even begin to think about what's your response going to be and how are you going to handle this data. So you really have to start at the end of the single particle analysis to be able to detect things. And as you saw, the complexity of how these particles move in the atmosphere just in our region is incredibly complicated, and until we sit and make permanent observations from over long periods of time, you're not going to be able to answer those questions. Do you want to be making your measurements 150 miles offshore and looking for a small remote-controlled aircraft that's going to fly by the region and put things in the air that are going to come into the region, and your response is going to be by the Navy trying to measure on shipboard? Or is it people going to be sitting on the other, possibly on the other side of the border, and things transported during times when the flow is north, as Ram says, or it can be from the south? How do you can't make an infinite number of measurements in an infinite number of spaces, so you have to be able to answer those questions, and it's really the heart and soul of the same questions we've been asking since we began here is, how do you make these particles, how do you transport them, and how do you detect them? And then you have to worry about handling the data and getting it immediately in the hands of decision makers so you can design your strategy in terms of response, be it medical or evacuational or whatever. So it's also part and parcel of that, all the way from the development of the detection technology to understanding the climatology and transport.
How long do you think it'll be before we understand what this long-term or this long-distance transportation of particle pollution, how that impacts the climate, whether or not it does have long-term impacts on the climate? I mean, is that something we're fairly close to understanding, or is that something that's still somewhere down the road?
I guess part of the answer is the resolution that you want to answer the question at. You know, when you say how much is the climate affected, there's different levels. I think at the quick level you say we know it affects climate, but at the precise level that you really want to know it is there's a lot of details that you don't know yet. Ram organized a workshop here some 2 or 3 weeks, I guess 3 or 4 weeks ago. People came, experts in the field of both climate modeling and aerosols, came for several days. And I guess you basically asked the theme of the conference to a certain extent is what's the role of these aerosols on climate, and I think everyone walked out of the room saying that we don't know at a level to satisfactorily answer that. And so for the next 10 years, we think that's where a lot of resources, both mental and financial, need to be dedicated to be able to answer that question. How do you couple the properties and how these aerosols are made with what the role is on climate? Because I don't think anyone at that conference said, yeah, we know everything well enough, let's study Mars. So that's...
I guess the other question I have, the other part of that, and you kind of alluded to it too, is the climate modeling. I mean, current climate models are incredibly complex, but, you know, in the overall scheme of things, they're still very primitive in what they can tell us. And when you introduce more variables, such as this, upper atmosphere transfer of particulate pollution, I could be way off here, but I don't see them as being really well equipped to adjust to that information in a meaningful way.
They have the transport, okay, but what they don't have is this particulates. For example, that's where what Kim is doing is some of the key things the climate community wants, and we don't know what's happening at the particulate level. That's what the models can't deal with. They have the long-range transport roughly okay, but they don't know what to transport. So for example, none of these models have anything even remotely close to what Kim is measuring. They treat these aerosols as pure sulfates. I think I'm correct in saying Kim never found a sulfate aerosol.
I haven't found one yet.
So this one needs the models.
That's what they use. I mean, if you look at I don't know if you've ever seen how they attribute, they break down the chemical composition of the different aerosols in types, and they say how much they warm or cool. There's one bar, the biggest bar I think, that says sulfates. And I always say, what are sulfates? The sulfates are on biomass burning. The sulfates are associated with different types of fuels, but there's no sulfates, and that's important because if you have sulfates, that's a reflector, so that's a cooler. But if you take sulfates and couple it with elemental carbon, which people are starting to talk a lot more about, that's a warmer. So what happens if you take a warmer and coat it with a cooler? They're mixed, and that's what's called the mixing state. And so no one in the modeling community has started. They're just starting to. In fact, I'm flying out to Colorado because the NCAR is going to start trying to figure out how to do it. They feel guilty because it's, it's a huge computational task. And they like, when I showed that simple picture of the total mixture versus the different types, they use the one on the left. They assume all particles are the same, right now, and that's still a huge computation. So when you start breaking them down to the hundreds of types that are present in the atmosphere and the different mixtures, like one of the mixtures is dust. Dust is one form that you can't say it's a warmer or a cooler. Depending on what the metals are that are in those dust particles, it could be one, or it can actually have both effects. And so people like to talk about dust as one type. from our measurements, we see, at any given time in a high dust environment like this storm, we were over in Asia sampling when the storms, where it originated. There were 50 types of just dust, the different associations, and all of those have different optical properties and will affect things differently. So you're absolutely right. It's a huge, huge computational task, and we're a ways, the 10 years, I think, is a good number, that we've got to start bridging all these different things we have, and it's going to take a while. But every study we did Indo-X, and then we just did ACE Asia, and the way to answer it is it's not, you have to go to these big different regions and figure out all the different signatures and where they're coming from, and and then as things mix, what happens there. And so you can think of, you have to go make measurements in all these different points, and ideally you'd like to make the measurements over longer times, as we've talked about here. And this will serve, I think, in San Diego we can make sort of the ultimate station to sort of show, we're going to measure a lot of particle things, not just to have our instrument, but a lot of different particle parameters, a lot of optical parameters, gas phase parameters, and measure everything simultaneously sort of as fast as you can, because the truth of the matter is we don't really know, what, if you told us we could measure one thing that's the culprit, we wouldn't know what to pick. So
I also want to give another example, to give a commercial to one of the discoveries of Mark Feeman's. We were in a meeting in the Himalayan foothills, mainly all the Indo-X scientists, and most of our models were treating as if these aerosols were produced at the surface, because the emission is surface. I think I'm correct in saying your measurements suggested instead many of these particles are produced way up there in the atmosphere, where 10 miles or close to that, and then brought down. That's just something the models are not even aware of. So we're extremely in a rudimentary stage.